just to be overly sensitive and defensive as I've come to be. So I hesitated to define the spectrum or the poles on the spectrum for you. I did not want to preset your suppositions or expectations, and so I went about this in a very sneaky way. And I'm just a sneaky sort of fellow. So that's me being overly defensive. Thank you once again for throwing me under the bus. However, I have a question for you. And that is, or I'd like to prompt you, would you please respond specifically to Jay Snodgrass's comments about being an exemplar?
Right. If I understand the question correctly, I would say that what we've already talked about in terms of character, Christian faithfulness, in all of those ways, I think we obviously are called to be exemplars. Paul says, "Follow me as I follow Christ." The hesitancy that I have, or I guess the reason why I was emphasizing the need to avoid replication and avoid kind of this photocopying of things, is because of the tendency in so many global South cultures to do just that, to be very concrete thinkers. And so even the sorts of materials that we're talking about, where we're saying this is not, you don't need to just copy this. This is just an example for you to follow. But again, back to the idea that we talked about earlier, or the example I gave from the panel earlier, in cultures that are very concrete thinkers, that's a difficult move for them to make. I was talking to Chris offline, and he said he was going to teach a class on preaching at a seminary where there were female students, and they said, well, we're gonna not have you teach that class because we don't want you to violate your own conscience in teaching females how to preach. And he said, no, I don't have a problem with females in the preaching class because the principles of exegeting Scripture and interpreting Scripture will be valuable for them in whatever context they end up ministering. But they couldn't have it. They're like, that was too dichotomistic of a thought process. They had no, you can't do that. It's too concrete. It's such a concrete way to think. So that I guess that's what I'm getting at with the kind of trying to avoid the photocopy tendency.
All right. So what are your questions?
Hey, good evening, good afternoon. Thanks so much for what you said. I have a super practical question.
Yeah.
I'm going to be in West Africa in 3 weeks. You were talking earlier about tool development, and if I heard you right, you seem to be like, well, there's too complex, there's also too simple.
Right.
I feel like, a lot of us, myself, I can tell when something's gotten too complex. So assuming both tools are complete, I'm not talking about incomplete, do you have any guidance on how to know when something has become too simple?
In some ways, I'll echo what Keith just said before we went to break, is in order to answer that question, we have to know the context. And so in order to answer the question of what's too simple for a given context, we would be dependent upon local believers and long-term missionaries. I think this goes back to something that Nathan said earlier in terms of, and even Chris hit on it as well this morning, in terms of the local people are the ones that can determine whether or not that pastor elder has met the qualifications. So many of the characteristics of an elder are determined by local reputation. Like they're the people that know him, and I think that's absolutely correct. I think there's another sense in which, and then we call that an emic or insider's perspective. There's another sense in which we have an etic or an outsider's perspective can be helpful because just every individual has blind spots. Cultures can have blind spots. So a long-term missionary, somebody can come in and also can help other cultures see those blind spots. So maybe that's a self-correction even to my own paper, and saying that the missionary still has a role to play in all of these things because he can help, just like an individual can do in my own life, outside missionaries can help cultures see blind spots or churches see blind spots.
Yeah, thank you.
Dr. Phil, thanks for that. That was super encouraging. I've admired your work from afar, especially your thinking in Africa, specifically raising up missionaries from Africa. As we look forward to the rise of the Global South, unless there is an economic resurgence in Africa that they've never seen before, can you help us think well as the next generation of missionaries go out on how not to create a dependence on Western funds to support African missions?
Yeah, I mean, so because that's something we thought about a lot while we were there, and again, one of my, and maybe it's an imperfect solution. We've all said like we do our best, and we know that none of us have the right solution. But one of my solutions was similar to the micro example I gave of how are these students going to get their data packages. I kind of just said, listen. So my approach to creating that missional awareness in sub-Saharan Africa was simply to create the missional awareness. Say it is your responsibility. The gospel or the Great Commission still applies to you. You do have this birthright and this responsibility to take the gospel to the nations. And a hesitancy to get involved in the nuts and bolts of how to create even a mission sending agency. You know, I mean, you can throw out general principles about you get out a whiteboard and say, how much could an individual person bring to church every Sunday for the cause of global missions? And you write that number down. How many churches are, and you start extrapolating that out. And there is more ability than even they're aware of. So Bryant Myers in Walking with the Poor talks about one of the tragedies of poverty is this poverty of self-worth. And I saw that all across Africa. And so just in lifting them up and saying, no, you can do this. You do have the ability to do this. Can you do it at the scale that the IMB does it tomorrow? No, you can't. But it doesn't take away from the birthright that they have to take the gospel to the nations. And the scalability thing we can worry about later.
So, Dr. American and
Dr. America, thank you.
So, I have noticed a reality that there are so many designing women that want to go to the mission field. So, I wonder that should women be included in the leadership development as you proposed to be prepared as a missionary? And if so, how?
So again, this goes back to an abstract answer and then a concrete application. So abstractly, I would strongly encourage women to be students at seminaries and women to get theological training and education. But I'm unapologetic complementarian, so I would not encourage women to enter the pastorate. And again, so the difficulty in applying that is trying to make this distinction that for a Western mind is very easy to say there's a distinction between theological training and pastoral ordination. So again, to concretize that a bit, the seminaries that I taught at, or at least two of the seminaries that I taught at in Africa, once you graduated from the seminary, you were automatically ordained. You got your undergraduate degree or graduate degree, whatever you were pursuing, and you also were ordained. And again, the strong tie between those two things made it difficult. So in the context of those situations, it's complicated. So then at that point, do you discourage female students from entering the seminary because there's this necessary exit with being ordained for ministry, and in that context, being ordained meant being a pastor. Again, there's just these things that we get up here and we present these papers that are just nice and clean, and then it gets to reality, and it's just a lot harder to apply. So abstractly, sure, female students should be welcomed into every seminary that I would ever be involved in, but concretizing that into given cultures and places, it gets a lot more complicated.
One more, if there is one. There is.
Because we sometimes don't know what we don't know.
Yeah.
And then there's situations like the reason behind why the trichotomist view was important in that context. How do you go about seeking to help yourself or others that are working to do theological education figure out what those issues are, so that the immediate context so you can figure out what the issues that need to be addressed in the immediate context are?
That slowly, graciously, and expecting that you're going to make mistakes. I mean, I don't know how else to answer it other than to say deliberately, maybe would be one more adverb that we can throw in there, but deliberately, slowly, expecting that mistakes are going to be made and understanding that there's grace for mistakes. And even what Keith was getting at earlier in terms of an allowance for some mistakes being made without wanting to get into anything heretical, but just allowing for some tertiary issues, trichotomistic, other eschatological issues, not being worried about that. And then, but the lines of where that line is not always as clean and crisp as we want to draw it. And so it gets really messy really fast.